there was a travel writer as late as the 18th century. So I'm not talking about 7th century Islam, I'm not talking about 8th century Islam, I'm not talking about 14, 15, 1300 years ago. I'm talking about the 18th century. One English travel writer, a female English travel writer, who traveled in the Muslim world, in particular the Ottoman Caliphate, and she had access not only to the public areas, but also the women's private areas, because she was a woman, unlike the male travel writers who would not have had that access. She said as follows: as to women, as many, if not more than men, are to be seen in the streets, i.e. going about their daily activities. I think I never saw a country where women may enjoy so much liberty and free from all reproach as in Turkey. The Turks, in their conduct towards our gender, are an example to all other nations. By Turks, she means the Muslims, because that's where she's traveling. And I repeat it, sir, I think no women have so much liberty, safe from apprehension, as the Turkish, and I think them in their manner of living capable of being the happiest creatures breathing. So this was her observation of Muslim women in the 18th century. So this is during the advent of Western feminism, of kind of around the time when Mary Wollstonecraft wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women. And already in the Muslim world, this was the condition of Muslim women. There are many, many quotes. This is just one of them. Now, if we compare that with today, which everybody in this room probably has some access or familiarity with, media and all this that is out there. In a Muslim society today, any lack of implementation of women's rights actually serves as a glaring piece of evidence that society overall is not actually functioning on Islamic principles. And the lack of rights for women is actually the symptom of a much deeper problem that actually pervades all other aspects of society. And this is really important for this discussion, and I hope you'll see why as I continue. Now, we don't have time to obviously do a really detailed diagnosis of the condition of the Muslim world in this short session, but by way of summary, I will say this to help you out, if anybody that isn't familiar with this already. Now, the Muslim world at the moment is exhibiting, and I say the Muslim world as a generic, but I mean, you know what I mean by that, the countries which are majority Muslim and that have had an Islamic past and a Muslim history. Now, the majority of that is presently exhibiting the trauma of post-colonialism. And one of the things that happened during colonialism was essentially the amputation of Islam from the education system. And what that means is, before, the education system at all levels included in-depth study of Islam, from its law to its structures, its jurisprudence, its theology, its basic principles, its language, Arabic. All of this was a core part of education, along with languages, maths, geometry. Of course, we know, if you haven't heard already, there is a lot of contribution of Muslims to science. You'll be having a talk on that later in the week, I think. So this was in addition to that, and all of that was composite. It was all part and parcel of the education. Now, one of the effects or the acts of colonialism was to separate that and to effectively secularize the education, so that the study of Islam, of this rich and dynamic legal system, of this social system, actually the understanding of that ended up becoming more and more shallow and removed from practical application and from practical use. And what this did was it gave rise to injustices, not only against women, but against men, because it ended up in more corruption, in more tyranny, and it ended up with power being the currency in society, where power and reputation is more important than principle. So society no longer functioned on principle, but on power and what you could get, more like each man for himself. And this shallow thinking actually ended up with some people, rather than, as is the tradition in Islam, to understand the Islamic text and the law and to apply jurisprudence to new situations, instead they would simply recycle or imitate the way that things had been done before, rather than legitimately exercise new legal reasoning with new problems. And what this means is that the current legal state doesn't reflect properly upon how it should be, and it doesn't reflect and match up with dealing with the problems in society. And not only did it lead to this shallow thinking, but often the people of these, some people, not all of them, but some people end up emulating and copying the ways of life of their former colonizers, and in particular the ideology that they were exposed to, which was secular liberalism. Now, Muslims of the post-colonial era, they often held that their cultures or practices, for any Muslims or anyone from the Asian subcontinent or from the Arab backgrounds or wherever, or maybe even anybody might recognize this from their parents if you are second generation, but they often held that their culture or practices of any of the ideologies or movements that they were part of, so for example, whether it was Arab nationalism, Arab national socialism, communism, or the Indian subcontinent, which was mixed with a lot of Victorian British ideals, as well as baggage from Indian culture, they often felt that all of these, or they tried to argue that all of these were compatible with Islam. They tried to argue that if it wasn't compatible, that it actually came from Islam itself. So this is how we end up, for example, in East Africa, with some Muslims believing that their practice of female circumcision, which actually dates back to ancient Egypt, and was also practiced by their Christian and animist neighbors, but they erroneously believe that this was from Islam itself. This is just an example of how people absorb the cultures around them and then believe it comes from their religion and try to emphasize it as being from their religion because they face the same pressures to uphold these cultures. Now, in such cases, people could have been ignorant about Islam, or they assimilated these practices. And similarly, today, Muslims are facing a similar, or you may witness Islam experiencing a similar challenge. So just with different cultures and practices. So it may not be those things, but it's different cultures and practices that we are experiencing, competing worldviews and some of this absorption. Now, today the cultural landscape is, again, different to ideologies of the past, but Muslims still, in the absence of a righteous Islamic government, are conflicted. And instead of a collision of cultures, which people often talk about, that, there is a collision of cultures, in fact, there is not a collision, but Muslims are actually being pulled in the direction of different competing values, just the same as any people would do if they were set and placed amongst a lot of different competing cultures and societies. The result is you end up pulled in a lot of different directions. Now, the reality is that for Muslims, regardless of time and place, regardless of which culture or land or which time period you are from, we're directed by God in the Holy Quran not to compete with each other based on cultures. Cultures are supposed to enrich us, and we are supposed to identify each other and enjoy our cultures by all means and celebrate our cultures, but we are not meant to, and we are not allowed to compete based on culture. Instead, we are told to compete in attaining righteousness. And this is something that both men and women are told to compete in, attaining righteousness. There's no other factor. It's attaining righteousness. So we find in the Quran, God says, "O mankind, we created you from a single pair of a male and a female, and made you into peoples and tribes, that you may know one another. Verily, the most honored of you in the sight of God is the most righteous of you." And this righteousness for Muslims is defined very clearly by Islam itself, not by any culture. And this actually obliterates any allegiance other than to Islam. Now, feminism too is a cultural influence. It's a cultural influence that is currently relevant. It may not be Arab socialism or nationalism or communism, but feminism is a cultural influence that is currently relevant because it happens to be significant right now in the UK, in the States, in secular liberal societies, in the West and in other parts of the world as well, in different formulations. And it also has influence in westernized parts of the Muslim world. So it's not uncommon to hear feminism being invoked as a remedy to some of the problems that women face. It's not uncommon to hear this. Now, unfortunately, a great deal of confusion and misunderstanding is actually generated when we imagine that feminism is the only way to visualize and actualize women's rights. And when we imagine that feminism is entirely synonymous with women's rights, that they are interchangeable terms. And then when we try to amalgamate as different worldviews, when we try to amalgamate feminism with another worldview such as Islam, it ends up with a lot of confusion. And this conflation, or saying that feminism and women's rights are interchangeable terms, they're one and the same thing, is in of itself a problem that we need to resolve. And what's interesting is that in the UK today, there was a study done by the Fawcett Society. For anyone not aware, that's one of the leading feminist societies in the UK. They did a study a couple of years ago, and they found that only 7 to 9% of women actually identify as feminists, even though the majorities of men and women that they themselves interviewed and found their findings, the majorities of men and women actually believe, they claim to believe, in gender equality. They believe in gender equality, but they don't identify as feminists. Only 7% of women chose to identify as feminists. Now this shows that feminists, or feminism itself, doesn't actually wield a monopoly on the concept of or the liberal idea of equality. It doesn't actually hold a monopoly, it doesn't hold a sole, it doesn't have exclusivity on women's rights. We can talk about women's rights without necessarily having to talk about feminism. We can be advocates of women's rights without necessarily having to call ourselves feminists, and many people do. And those who do identify as feminists are just one group amongst many throughout different cultures and time periods whose work deals with women's rights. Now, another way to explain this point is that feminism is to women's rights what capitalism and communism are to economics. So economics, in other words, is about the distribution of resources, right? Economics is about the distribution of resources, and capitalism and communism each have their own approaches on resource distribution. They are not economics themselves, they have approaches to economics. These are economic systems, but they are not economics. Similarly, feminism is just one approach to the matter of women's rights, and other worldviews have different approaches. Islam has another approach to women's rights. Now, currently, with specific regards to feminism, because that's one of the approaches that we're talking about today, Western culture and civilization, or secular liberal culture and civilization, is largely based on the idea of individualism. And individualism makes the assumption that humans are mainly individuals with no purpose except to exist as individuals. Being the individual is more important than anything else. However, humans, like cells in the body, aren't merely individuals. Humans are social creatures. We're defined involuntarily to some extent by society, by culture, by our parents, by our genetics, by the languages we're taught. We're very much defined by the languages we're taught, and we don't even get a say in the first language we're taught. We can't learn language without being taught by another person. That's how dependent we are on other human beings. That's how non-individual we all actually are. If anybody has actually looked into or studied the phenomenon of feral children, you'll see that at some point, if children don't learn to speak, they don't have human interaction to learn to speak by the age of maybe 5 or 6 or something like that, they will never, ever, ever learn the skills, the motor skills, to be able to speak. That's how dependent we are on other people in our infancy, at a period where we don't have the ability to do things for ourselves. So this is how non-individual we are. We're creatures that have so many instinctive needs that can only actually be fulfilled by other people. And this is why solitary confinement, for example, is actually considered one of the most inhumane punishments. To cut somebody off from other people, even if they're other prisoners, it's considered to be one of the worst punishments that you could give to somebody, to shut them away, solitary confinement. Now, humans were created in the universe, and we came into the universe with our nature, with our genetics. We weren't responsible for creating the universe. We didn't create our nature, we didn't create our genetics. And humans are mostly passive recipients of all of these realities. And you can't really escape those by and large. The more social things you can filter out and decide, but these realities actually come or reflect or show that there is a higher truth that we are part of. And individualism's claim to actually put the person above these realities is usually what it calls liberation. So to say that a person does not have to obey religious commandments, a person does not have to obey, certain things in society because you're an individual, you should be able to do whatever you want. This is, or to a certain, in a certain manner, this is what it calls liberation, and actually it's one of its biggest delusions, because ultimately it ends up disconnecting humans from that higher reality, from that higher purpose. And it leaves them vulnerable to the oppression of whoever happens to have most power in society. That is what happens. Now, one example to explain this is the idea that, this idea that our conceptions and rights are determined by our creator, is the question of who owns your human body. Now, I'm not talking about from a legal perspective specifically, I'm just talking about who owns your human body. And one of the key messages that is commonly either in a subtle way or an overt way that is perpetuated, particularly to women, or just to people generally, is that your body is yours. You can do with it whatever you want. You can dress it or undress it however you want, regardless of the circumstances, on the basis that, doesn't matter what it's saying, but on the basis that your body belongs to you. This is the argument. This is not only touted by fashion designers who want you to buy things, but also by some feminist groups as well that uphold, sex-positive feminism, for example. And what they are upholding is one of the underlying fundamentals of liberal feminism, which is the idea of ownership over one's body. Now, for secular liberal feminists, the idea that a woman should practice modesty, for example, or a Muslim woman should practice modesty, or that society can be a reason or pressure you or be any factor in your consideration for how you dress, actually implies that your body does not belong to you. This is the claim that is often made. Your body is yours, you should be able to do whatever you want with it. And they have long complained, such secular liberal feminists have long complained that the female, and there's going to be some terminology here, so do stay with me, but they argue that the female has been regarded as enmeshed in her bodily existence in a way that makes the attainment of rationality questionable. What they mean by that is that women, unlike men, are perceived as being bodies instead of being rational beings that happen to have bodies. This is the idea, and they call this concept enmeshment or embodiment. And according to these feminists, they seek to argue, I am not my body, I own my body, and society or men's ideas do not own my body. Now the question is, how exactly do any of us, men or women, how do we own our own bodies? For example, if ownership is control, then neither men nor women actually own their own bodies. Did we give birth to ourselves? Did we make ourselves? Did we decide our natural size and shape? We didn't. If ownership is maintenance, then can we actually survive without depending on other bodies, on other people, either as an individual or as a human race? Can we actually survive without depending on others, either trading with us or looking after us when we're young or looking after us when we're older or when we're sick? Can we actually survive? Are we independent of that? Are we independent of our environment and the need for social interaction, for our continued existence and even mental well-being? Now, Islam recognizes that we do not, neither men nor women, we do not own our own bodies, and therefore we don't have a complete blanket right to decide what we do with our bodies, whether that's to do with how we dress, whether that's to do with how we act in society, whether that's to do with anything. Instead of ownership, we are actually taught that we are entrusted with our bodies. So our bodies are a trust. In Arabic, this is known as amana. So we have a responsibility towards our bodies and also with our bodies. What we do in society, we will be accountable for because we've been given, limbs and a physical state and the ability to do things. We'll be accountable for all of that, and therefore it's considered something that you're entrusted with. And we also have rights and duties towards each other with those. Now, simply speaking, as a comparison, feminism as an ideology makes the female individual, rather than the male individual, the judge or the arbiter in working out what is good for women in society. And Islam, on the other hand, doesn't make either men or women the judge or the arbiter, but actually makes God the judge or the arbiter, and it makes men and women the agents of that. So we have a duty to fulfill and to satisfy what the judge has said about how we should be interacting with each other. Now, for Muslims, it was God. It was God, not any man-made theories, not humans. It wasn't Mill or Bentham or any Ahmed or Iqbal. It wasn't any humans that came up with these rights. But for Muslims, it was God that decided that a woman's deeds would be judged no differently than a man's deeds in terms of good conduct, truthfulness, patience, charity, fasting, repentance, inviting to what is good and forbidding of what is bad, her use of knowledge. So, for example, not only as having a duty to obtain knowledge, but as a political player in society, or as somebody that is, active in society. It was God, not humans, that stated in the Quran, "I do not waste the deed of any doer among you, be they male or female. The one of you is as the other." It was God that stated that. Women didn't have to campaign and lobby with placards for generations and generations for this. For us, it was God that has said this. Our duty is to make sure that these principles and these and some of the rules that I'll go into, that they are implemented. Not that as a basis they are even agreed upon. We don't have to even argue about that. It was God, not humans, that decided there will be no difference between a man's worship and a woman's worship. So in Islam, a woman is an independent entity, like a man, and a fully accountable human being, like a man. Her acceptance of Islam is only of her own original and independent will. It's not by proxy through her father, her husband, or anyone else. So if you see a woman that starts to wear the hijab, don't automatically assume that her father, her husband, or anyone else has told her to do so. It's quite possible she has an independent and free will in doing that. It was God, not humans, that decided that she should have her own legal standing, that she could aspire towards any profession or vocation, and if she chose to raise children, then God decided that heaven would be under her feet. It wasn't, again, man coming up with this to promote women having babies. It wasn't women that protested for these rights. These were rights set out by God. It was God, not humans, that decided that a woman had the right to be provided for financially, that nobody could control her wealth is her own, and that if she were to provide for her family, she would actually get more reward than her husband. And it was God that decided that a woman would have rights over her husband just as he had rights over her. It was God, not humans, that ordained that she should have the right to respect, affection and time from her husband, the right to physical satisfaction by her husband, the right to shelter provided by her husband, the right to food and clothing equal in quality to her husband's, although some guys generally dress a lot worse than their wives, so maybe equality is not what we're going for with that. The right to physical protection provided by her husband, the right to a dowry. All of this was from God, not from man, not from nature, not from any of that. Now, as a result of some of these, women have often played a fundamental role. For example, the economic rights that I mentioned. Women didn't use this just to, sit on their laurels and, hoard and amass wealth. Instead, and as they continue to do today, women have often played a very fundamental role in the distribution of wealth. So while they were being provided for, they had more disposable income, more savings to do with what they want. And in the 18th century, for example, Ottoman women of all classes, not just the upper classes, not just the wealthy classes, Ottoman women of all classes actually established 20 to 30% of all the charitable foundations and trusts in society. In Arabic, this is called waqf or awqaf as plural. So this included things like schools, hospitals, caravansaries, baths, fountains, soup kitchens, hostels, mosques. They were all financed by women from their own personal resources for the benefit of the public. It was God, not humans, that decided that a woman would be obliged, just as a man was, to seek knowledge, to the extent possible for either of them, to seek an education, to advocate what is good in society and to discourage what is bad. It was God, not humans, that actually ordained that vast proportions of Islam, as we know it today, would actually be transmitted to Muslims by women. By women themselves, we have come to learn so much of what is